Hello to everybody and welcome to this Rudyard Kipling Balance session. Today we are delighted to have with us Philipp Hildebrand. Philipp is Vice Chairman of BlackRock. Before, he was the Chairman of the governing body of the Swiss National Bank. He's a very respected figure in the financial world, all around the world, I could say. We know each other since several years ago, and I am absolutely delighted to have Philipp with us today. So welcome, Philipp, to the Kipling Balance.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming. And we will, as we have asked you to select one of the verses of the poem "If" by Rudyard Kipling. It's always very difficult to select one of the verses. In fact, I always fear that people are going to select the same one, but it's so rich, the whole poem, that it is not happening, that each person is selecting one. And you have selected one which is, I would say it has a very deep meaning. It is the one that says, or watch the things you gave your life to broken and stoop and build them up with worn out tools. So why did you decide to select this verse, Philipp? What does it mean for you? The whole poem, I would say, but then, of course, specifically the one you have selected.
Well, I think the specific, when you asked me the question, first of all, I love this poem, and I was impressed that you build your podcast around it. And then I looked at it, and very quickly, almost instantly, these couple lines jumped out. And I think, for two reasons. One, in terms of some of my personal experiences, but also it reminded me of, in a sense, of what Europe is facing at the moment with a dramatic change, really, in the transatlantic foundational relationship almost that we've had with the United States for so many years. A radical change. Something is broken that was very important to us. So it resonated with me both from a personal perspective in terms of some of the setbacks I've endured during my career, but also in a sense very much in the context of what is happening around us as we speak.
Wow, so it's very... So, and why don't you elaborate a little bit more, let us say, first of all, from a personal point of view, why this verse and what does it mean for you? And then perhaps we can elaborate a little bit more also regarding the second part and what do you think about Europe?
Sure. Well, when you suffer a big setback, and in my case it was when I resigned as governor of the Swiss National Bank, as you mentioned, which is a job that I loved. I loved working for my country in a way. This was probably the highest calling that anybody can have. And these things are very painful, and then you have to come to terms with it and decide what to do. And I think the essence of these lines in this poem is really that you basically get up and, get back to work one way or another. And in the beginning, it's with worn out tools because you're injured, you're hurt, your reputation may be hurt, and all you can do is basically look ahead and get up and try not to look back. There is this wonderful references, several in the great literature and in Western civilization. There's the story in the Bible of Lot, who's not allowed to look back. There is Orpheus, very much the same, similar story in Greek mythology, that when you face bad things, you have to look ahead and move ahead and find the strength, the inner strength given to you by your family, by your surroundings, by your beliefs, to basically carry on. And when I resigned, one of my mentors, Paul Volcker, the legendary chair of the Federal Reserve back in the 70s, said to me at that time, you will die with this, but you won't die from it, which again is something that I really took to heart. And so you have to get up and, in the beginning, work with worn-out tools and get back to work. And so these are moments, I think, that are inevitable. Every rich life has versions of this. That's why all our great stories, our great mythologies. They're often built around this, and you just have to look forward. All good things come from ahead. Once somebody once told
me. And this
me.
that you are saying, of course, it can be very relevant when there is a big setback. But I think it's also relevant in not so big setbacks. This mentality. So. Looking forward, so never give up, so being resilient, I think is to management, to business, to leadership, is something that is really very, very applicable. I mean, it's not to look at what has happened. So, of course, you need to learn lessons from what has happened, but always to look forward and to be resilient and not to give up, I think is essential in leadership by every way. So this is something which for me is very, very relevant. Philipp, and you were mentioning the Europe, and I think later on we will come back to more, I would say, leadership things and so on. But what about Europe? What about the situation in the world, the economy, the geopolitical issues? Why don't we talk a little bit about that?
Well, I believe that if you look at European history after the war, and really, in many ways, from an economic perspective, it began in Bretton Woods. And of course, the entire construct of what we have had for past decades, for many decades now, has really been around this transatlantic relationship. There was this famous quote by Henry Morgenthau, the then Treasury Secretary at Bretton Woods, who famously said, "Prosperity and peace are indivisible. Prosperity is indivisible." This is, of course, that one simple phrase just shows you how much we've now moved into a world where suddenly the allies get treated aggressively, confrontationally. And so the entire foundational fabric of the transatlantic relationship that has been so important to Europe and to our way of understanding the world is now being questioned. And I think this is why this poem struck me, or these couple of lines in the poem struck me intuitively, realizing that this is also something that is applicable to what we face right now as Europeans. Namely, it very much looks like we have to rebuild a new world in a way. If you listen to the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, just a few days ago, he made the same point, saying we're going to have to completely reconstruct our economy. And so these are moments of shock, but particularly in the European context, these existential challenges, again, can bring great dynamism and can hopefully allow us to tackle some of the things we should have tackled a long time ago, but are now forced to do it in a way under pressure.
Mm-hmm. And you think it's so I don't know what word to use, but that the situation is so significant as to need to change completely the European approach to the world and to itself. So you think it's going to last this situation? And
situations never last statically.
Yeah.
There's always action, reaction. There is the market. There is the economy. But I think this is a watershed event, and I believe we will look at this, you and I, 10, 20 years from now, as the moment when Europe had to fundamentally, in a sense, address some of its shortcomings and, in a sense, grow up, right? This is perhaps also the moment of maturity for Europe. So I want to make sure that this comes across not just as a negative, and this is, I think, the essence of the poem, that these moments that seem terrible when you face them,
that you can,
and sometimes how am I going to do this with worn out tools? Well, you invent new tools and you find new answers
and
to
you
old
see
problems.
Europe, you see the possibility of really Europe.
I think so. I think this is
necessity,
the moment.
No?
This is Jean Monnet, the founding father of Europe, of course, said famously that people only change in times of necessity, and necessity only comes in times of crisis.
Yeah.
And I think this is a crisis, an existential crisis for Europe, and hopefully we'll find the strength to respond in a way that 10, 20 years from now we'll see this moment actually as a positive moment for Europe.
Okay. Let us move, Philipp, to other type of questions, because we could stay talking about this, so it's so interesting. But I wanted to talk also with you about leadership, about strategic thinking, about what do you think are the qualities that you look for in your teams. But first of all, starting, because you have had a career in which you have combined the public sector and the, well, private, then public, then private sector again. And so it's a very unique, in this sense, trajectory. Do you think this experience in both public and private sector has influenced your way of approaching to management, to leadership, to strategic thinking, or do you think it doesn't make a so big difference?
No, I think it has. It has inspired me. And I was, even as a student, I was inspired by, mostly in the U.S. Back in those days, it was in the U.S. where people were able to combine both. People like James Baker or George Shultz, who had careers in both. They have always inspired me, and they were kind of, later in life, I got to meet some of them. They were, very important. So I think it is something. Now, it's very different. It's important, particularly in the current context. Running a company is not the same as running a government. When you run a company, you can fire people, you can close divisions, you can realign your expenses and your revenue, you can make your share price go up. If you run a country, that analogy doesn't work. You can fire people from the US government, but they're still going to be around and they're going to cost you somewhere else, either in unemployment benefits or... So Paul Krugman wrote a famous paper on this in the 80s, the sort of misleading parallels between companies and governments. And I think many of the CEOs who end up running countries can run into this problem. So it is different, but of course, you can learn from each, which hopefully makes you a better leader if you have the chance to be to have the opportunity to work in both places. Mm-hmm. So I have found this to be an incredibly enriching experience.
And how would you define yourself as a leader? Are you very demanding? Are you, I don't know, how would you define yourself?
I think
and the second part of this question, when you think about your teams, what qualities do you value the most when you are thinking about people that you like to work in your teams?
So I think one of the great takeaways from having been in government, particularly during the financial crisis, is that really bad things can happen.
Yeah.
And you have to be prepared for it. And I think you can take that into your leadership skills as a corporate or private leader. Tim Geithner, the then Treasury Secretary, when the crisis began, he called a few of us together in Washington. And I'll always remember he said, listen, plan beats no plan. So you have to imagine that bad things can happen, and you have to have a plan. In reality, that plan will be amended, will be undermined, will be changed. But you have to have kind of a strategic perspective. You have to have a plan, and I think that's very much true for the private sector, where often people get buffeted around by daily market pricing, by quarterly earnings. You know all about that. And so I think this idea of having the grounding in a kind of long-term strategy and perspective. And then culture, I think, is key. Culture and the kinds of people you want to be leaders. And if you believe in culture and in picking the right leaders, that then takes you to your basic philosophy that once you've picked them, you have to give them the space to run.
Yeah, all the things you are mentioning are very relevant. In terms of running a company, I always say that you need to have a long-term perspective, but at the same time, a short-term focus, because for me, what works is the combination of both. No, it is a long-term perspective for sure. It depends also very much on the type of business, the type of company, but at the same time, for example, if it's a commercial company in whatever sector, you need to pay a lot of attention to daily sales. So it's a long-term perspective, knowing where you want to go, but then, of course, always at the same time, short-term focus, combining both. And then what you are saying about culture, I fully agree. I think culture makes a difference. And if you have the right people, giving them space, you were saying giving them freedom, because this is essential. And it makes a huge difference. And this concept is different depending on the type of company you are talking about. It cannot be the same when you talk about freedom, I don't know, in a financial institution than in a fashion company is different, but the philosophy, I think, and having the being very agile, not having bureaucracy, meaning different things in the different sectors. And how would you define BlackRock's culture, Philipp?
Well, early on when I travel a lot with our founder and CEO, Larry Fink, and I remember in the first 5, 6, 7 years, when the story of BlackRock became known, now it's very well known, but in the early kind of years, 10, 7, 8 years ago, people would always ask, well, how was it possible to build this company? And how do you spend your time? These were the types of questions I would be in the room when people would ask this to Larry Fink. And I was struck in the beginning that he always answered the same way. He said, most of my time I actually spend on culture. Companies die or companies go off the rail typically when there is a cultural problem. And so I think one of the very impressive things is that I see this continuously being applied, the focus on culture and, of course, the focus on change. The world changes. The world has changed dramatically around us. Just think of the last 20 years. We had the biggest financial crisis in history. We had a global pandemic. We're in the midst of a severe geopolitical crisis. Things that would have been hard to imagine. Who would have expected a global pandemic to hit us? Now, historians might have told us this is likely to happen, but none of us expected it. And so the ability to combine the focus on culture with an ability to instill a culture that can deal with change and can evolve constantly. And this is, the two things that I take away from BlackRock and what I see every day is really this incredible willingness and ability to address change, always seeing the opportunities, and then making sure that the culture can cope with it and can evolve. And of course, culture, as you know better than anyone, starts at the top.
But this is, I fully agree with what you are saying, and it's something that looks easy to say, but it's challenging and complex, particularly when an organization grows and grows, because, for example, if we talk about BlackRock, now you have, I think, more than 11 trillion of assets under management, 20,000 people, more or less, working in the company. So it makes things, it's a constant effort, I would say. And then this idea of culture, of course, you can have a lot of formal programs, but at the same time, it has a lot to do with informal, so having the right people, promoting them, giving them freedom, and having this culture of opportunity. And for example, this here at IE University is something which is very, very evident, is selecting very good people and then giving them freedom to start new projects, to develop new initiatives, and this changes everything, this ability to take decisions. But I think it needs to be, and it has a lot to do with the people at the top, as you were saying.
Very much so. We're lucky. We still have two founders at the top of the organization and one founder on the board. And so this connection to the sort of basic philosophy is still there, and it's very important. And I think the other thing that helps, and it's true for universities, you have to be in touch with your clients.
Yeah.
One of the most amazing experiences that I remember after the crisis, I was able to look at some of the minutes of the board meetings of the biggest banks in Switzerland at the time. And what you realize when you read these board minutes, there was very little focus on the clients. It was all about financial engineering, about leverage, about this and that, but they had dropped the ball on clients. And I think this is, again, same, I'm sure is true for universities. You have to think about your students. You have to be in touch with them.
That needs to be the center.
You need to know where the clients are and what the clients need. And this, I think, is, again, something I've learned from Larry Fink.
And that's very important because it is true that there is a risk in any type of company. Once you start growing and growing and growing, that you can start being, endogamic. So only thinking about yourself, thinking that the world moves around you. Yeah. And one of the elements that could happen, one of the things that could happen is for you to forget about your customers or your clients, and then if you do that, you are completely lost. Or another risk in companies is if you become arrogant. That is, and it happens a lot because you are a successful company, you forget that, so you start to think that you are, and this can be the end. From the point of view of culture, this is absolutely dramatic. If this happens inside a company, you start the decline immediately. So
that's why travel is so important. As much as it's tiring and exhausting, but usually before any trip, I'm like, oh God, I've got to do another trip. But then as soon as you're on the ground, you realize that you learn things and you see things that you wouldn't see if you're just staying in your office. So the contact to your clients, to your customers, to your shareholders is very important.
Very, very important. And for example, you are mentioning clients, etc., but also, and I was going to mention shareholders and investors. I always remember during the roadshows that sometimes before doing them, you say, well, now I have 1 week of roadshows. But after that, you always, if you go with the right approach and the right attitude, you always take things from that. And of course, first of all, you are obliged because it's part of being a public company, if you are a listed company. But second, so always traveling, so meeting your clients, meeting your teams in the different parts of the world. And then at the same time, also this part with investors, I think is very, very helpful. Always combining, because I'm sure it's something that you also do, no? That because you cannot lead a company or you cannot have a very relevant leading position in a company if you are never there. So you need to combine both things, no? Traveling, but also being also at the...
Absolutely. And always be... One of our core principles is you have to be, and everybody has to be, a student of the market.
Yeah.
Now, there's this famous story, I don't know if it's true, but when John F. Kennedy went to see the launch program of the Apollo program at the time, and he saw some guy sweeping the floor, and he asked him, "Sir, what do you do?" And the answer was, I help bring a man on the moon. And this is, of course, the story about being engaged in the mission of the company and being a student of the market, no matter where you are in the organization. So that's something we really try to bring to all our employees, to say, if you work at BlackRock, you have to be a student of the market.
Yeah, that's very... And Philipp, any leaders that have inspired you, it could be in business or in politics or in history, that have inspired you during... your life?
Yes. Well, I was very lucky. After graduate school, or during graduate school already, in fact, during my undergraduate years, I started working at the World Economic Forum in Davos for the meetings. They used to have students help them. And in that context, I got to meet Nelson Mandela and actually spent quite a bit of time with him, several days. And I have to say, to this day, that was an extraordinary experience in terms of inspiration, in terms of leadership, in terms of humanity, something that I'll never forget. And I still have, at the end, after 4 days being with him, he gave me a big hug and he said, "You can call me Madiba," which in the tribal language I was later told, meant a lot. If he offered you that meant...
Yeah, that was... so, Philipp, this is impressive. I am getting with a little emotion because I never met him in person, but for me, he's one of the most inspiring leaders. In fact, I organized in Inditex at the time when the movie was released, the movie Invictus, I organized a projection of the movie and then a debate with the author of the book, John Carlin, because it has been always, for me, one of the most inspiring figures in history.
I'll tell you a story. We were coming out of Davos. There was nobody left, no journalists, no press. Back then, there was no social media. And we were about to get in the car to bring him back to the hotel, and we passed the kind of kitchen entrance. And he insisted on going through the kitchen and thanking all the staff at the World Economic Forum for bringing out all the food for the last few days. There was nobody there to watch him. I was the only one with him and his security detail. Yeah. And this is the kind of gesture that was
completely
just
authentic, and it's very...
it was amazing. And then later on, I was lucky in my life as a central banker. I mentioned Paul Volcker. Mario Draghi has been an exceptional leader to work with. And
he was key to save Europe in the euro and Europe in a very difficult...
And I was lucky to work with him early on, during and right after the financial crisis in my days as a young central banker. Tim Geithner, again, I mentioned, during the financial crisis, who really stepped up and brought in also, again, in contrast to what's happening today, really brought in the international colleagues that were relevant to the financial crisis, irrespective of whether you were from a big or a small country. So these are people that have been very impressive and important in my life.
Yeah. And you have had the opportunity to work together, no, with many of them, which is, yeah. In my case, well, these people that you are mentioning, of course, all of them are very admirable from every point of view, no. But I because of my trajectory, let us say this way, I focus more on founders of companies.
Yeah.
And it's of course Amancio Ortega, that is the one who I know the best, no, as you can imagine. But I don't know, Howard Schultz, the founder of Starbucks, that I also have been. We are friends, and so the founders of companies is something that for me, or I could think about Sam Walton in the US. These people that start a company from nothing, then they build. For me, this is something really impressive, no, when you think about founders of companies. But all these people that you are mentioning are really,
leaders are extremely important. Let's just think of Europe at the moment. We talked about this existential crisis. The last time anything similar to happened to what's happening today, I would argue, was when the Soviet Union collapsed. And Europe suddenly was, again, in an existential crisis with chaos in Eastern Europe. Back then you had Mitterrand in France, Helmut Kohl in Germany, and Jacques Delors at the Commission. And within 2 years, by 92, they had the Maastricht Treaty, and by 93 it was ratified. And that launched the last great accomplishment in Europe, in a sense, the euro. And so, it was both the external shock that created this, but it was also the leadership at the time. And I think this is, in a sense, we now have the shock externally, no doubt, perhaps even greater than what happened in 89. And the question is, can the leaders rise, and can we have a similar dynamic now led by some of the leaders in Europe to make sure that this opportunity can be seized by Europe?
So we need to be optimistic, but at the same time, we need to push the leaders as much as possible.
Well, your dean here, of course, Enrico Letta,
yeah.
I think, has, the one thing that I'm optimistic about, it is thanks to Enrico and Mario Draghi and others, it is no longer really a question of what to do in Europe. We actually know what we need to do. We know what
we need to do.
We need deeper capital markets, we need defense capabilities, we need more competitiveness, and we need ultimately some sort of financial infrastructure system that works and that can foster innovation, all of this together. And these two reports, the Letta report and the Draghi report, have actually, I think, are incredibly important in laying out what needs to be done.
I agree. And Philip, moving to something more personal. What about you, your hobbies, your routine? Well, I learned that you were a swimming champion in Switzerland, no, several years ago.
Quite a long time ago, yes.
Yeah, now you could be in the veteran. So what do you exercise? Do you meditate? How do you organize your hobbies?
I do meditate. I've had 2 mentors, one in Singapore, also a very prominent business leader and government leader in his past, and actually a priest in France. He's English, or Irish originally, but who now works out of a monastery, and the monastery has become a center of what we call contemplative meditation. And so I think this is something extremely important to give you grounding, particularly in a world that is so fast moving, and obviously technology, social media has made this much, much worse. I campaigned for the OECD for Switzerland a few years ago, and I didn't get it in the end. But one of the worst experiences of this campaign was to be on Twitter. And I hated it. And you realize just how awful it becomes. You become addicted to seeing how many people follow you, and you think you need to kind of say something new every day. So I think finding ways to ground yourself, whether it's through exercise, meditation, is very important. To me, I would say it's the outdoors, the mountains in Switzerland. I'm a very passionate, person about my own country, about Europe. And so I love being in the mountains as much as I can. Again, I find that gives me a kind of a grounding.
And that in Switzerland is quite easy.
It's easy to do, exactly. And then family, I think, is very important. Yeah, these things are critical. And I think the more the world goes crazy around you, the more you need to ground yourself. There was a great interview with Lee Kuan Yew on meditation years and years ago by this Father Lawrence, who is my mentor on meditation. And he interviews Lee Kuan Yew and he says, do you find meditation is important? He says, it's very important, particularly for heads of states who are about to make important decisions, particularly when they involve life and death. Mm-hmm. Any leader who has to make life or death decisions should definitely meditate before he makes those decisions, which was a very interesting comment to come from Lee Kuan Yew.
Very interesting.
So I think these are, it's important that we find ways to ground ourselves and to take the attention away from ourselves in a sense as a leader, because if you become obsessed with yourself, that's a bad recipe.
Yeah, personally, and if we think about companies again, it could be exactly the same. And Philipp, two final questions, because we could stay talking for many hours, but two final questions. The first one would be if you could share with us some achievement that you feel really proud about during your career. And the second one would be what advice would you give to IE students that are in their early 20s or in their what advice would you give to them in terms of their career, their approach to life, to etc.?
I think for me during my career so far, I would say the financial crisis, and particularly we had really a critical issue at the time with UBS and had a big rescue operation that could have brought down certainly the national financial system, could have potentially impaired badly the global financial system. And working with so many different actors, with my colleagues at the central bank, the regulators, the UBS itself, and being able to do that as a small country in a global context with the market pressing on us very hard, in cooperation with, at the time, Jean-Claude Trichet in Europe, Ben Bernanke in the US, Tim Geithner, and many others, is something that I'm not sure pride is the right word for it, but it was an extraordinary privilege. It was a terrifying experience in many ways, but at the same time an enormous privilege to be able to, contribute to stabilizing something that inherently could have gone really, really badly.
And it was
successful.
It was successful and very, very difficult.
It was very difficult. I remember the night, and this is perhaps good advice for students, I remember the night before we launched the rescue. This had been weeks and weeks of preparation, and nothing had leaked, which was one of our primary worries. And then by 11:30 that night, we completed everything. We had briefed the cabinet, and I came out in Bern and went to the one place that was still open to get, some steak and frites. And I thought, okay, this is it now. Now the ship is going to get launched and there's nothing else we can do. But I felt a sense of calm in thinking we had done, to my knowledge, everything that we could have possibly done to give us the best chance of success. And from then on, it was kind of, just believing in it and letting it go, letting the ship sail.
Yes.
And I think this is important for students. In the end, you cannot control everything, but you can work hard, you can be well prepared, and you can position yourself ideally. And then at some point that gives you the confidence and the faith, in a sense, to say, now it's time to let it go. And so this is something that I'll always remember that night at 11:30, stepping out of my office, trying to find a place to eat something, and just to recognize, there's a moment to prepare, there's a moment to be innovative, to come up with solutions, and then there's the moment where you have to let it go and have faith that you've done the best possible job that you could have done. So, and in terms of, advice for students, I think try always to be at this intersection. This is what's so exciting about the school. You're not just a business school. I was intrigued to learn that you have a humanities and architecture program today.
Yes.
I think it's very important. And if any of your students have an opportunity at some point to serve their country and then go back into business, go back into the private sector, I think that combination of seeing both a balance sheet from a kind of corporate perspective and seeing a balance sheet from a national perspective is a very, very positive experience in my view.
Well, very good piece of advice, Philip. Thank you very much for being with us at this
Great to be here.
Kipling Balance.